I want you to picture something really quick. Think back to that classic childhood piggy bank.
Oh, yeah, the little ceramic one.
Right, exactly. The one where you put your allowance in, and the idea is that it just sits there completely safe, right? And then later you learn about banks and you think, okay, well, a bank is just a giant piggy bank. You put your money in and they hold on to it. Or maybe they lend those exact same dollars out to a neighbor to buy a car.
Which makes perfect logical sense. I mean, it's what we're all taught.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Today, we are completely shattering that illusion. Surveys actually show that like 60% of people still believe that's how banking works. But it is completely 100% false.
It really is. And finding out the truth is usually a pretty profound shock for people.
Oh, for sure. So today we are doing a deep dive into a documentary called The System of Money, which explores this concept known as 97% owned. And our mission here is basically to pull back the curtain on how money is actually created, right? Like who benefits from it and how this whole hidden system impacts everything from your ability to buy a house all the way up to global geopolitical power.
Yeah, because we aren't just talking about personal finance here. We're looking at the hidden foundation of international dominance. The mechanics of our monetary system are, well, they operate in almost direct opposition to what you'd expect.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the numbers here are staggering. If you look at the actual economy, there's this stark mathematical reality. Only about 3% of the money supply exists as physical cash, like actual coins and notes.
Right. And that really begs the question, who exactly is creating the other 97%?
Exactly. So to understand the global economy, we have to start with the literal creation of the cash in our pockets. Or I guess the cash not in our pockets.
Right, yeah. So to grasp this, we first have to look at that 3% that the central bank, so like the Bank of England or the U.S. Federal Reserve, the money they actually do create.
The physical stuff.
Exactly. When a central bank prints physical money, they generate a profit. It's this concept known as seigniorage.
Wait, senior?
Yeah, seigniorage. Basically, think about it like this. It costs, say, just a few pennies to physically print a 50-pound note or a $100 bill, right?
Oh, right. Just the cost of the paper and ink.
Exactly. But the face value is 50 pounds. So that difference, that massive profit margin, goes straight to the public purse. The documentary points out that in the UK, around 2010, that process raised about 18 billion pounds for the Treasury over a decade.
18 billion, which, I mean, that sounds like a lot of money.
It does, yeah, until you look at the private sector side of the ledger.
Right, because that other 97% of the money supply, what the sources officially call commercial bank money, it's completely digital.
Just numbers on a screen.
Literally just numbers. And it is created out of thin air by private commercial banks the second they issue a loan. So while the public treasury made 18 billion pounds over a decade, private banks created 1.2 trillion pounds of digital money over that same period. Trillion with a T.
What's fascinating here is the accounting trick behind it. It's brilliant, really, but it has massive consequences. It relies on something called demand deposits.
Okay, break that down for us.
So imagine you sit down at a desk in your local high street bank and you sign a mortgage agreement for a house.
Okay, I signed the papers.
Right. The bank does not go down into some vault, scoop up a bunch of pensioners' deposited life savings, and hand them to you.
Wait, really? So when I get a mortgage to buy a house, they aren't lending me someone else's savings. It's more like a magic checkbook where the money literally springs into existence the second I sign the loan.
That is exactly what happens. Through double-entry bookkeeping, the bank creates two things simultaneously. First, they create an asset on their books, which is your legal promise to pay them back over 30 years with interest.
Right, because I owe them.
Exactly. But at that exact same second, they create a liability. They just type numbers into your account balance. That digital money did not exist anywhere in the universe before your pen hit that paper.
That is wild. And there's this moment in the documentary that just completely crystallizes this. They play this interview from 2009 with Ben Bernanke, who was the head of the Federal Reserve at the time.
Oh, yeah, the AIG bailout interview.
Yes. The journalist is pressing him on the $160 billion bailout of AIG, and they point blank ask him, like, hey, is this taxpayer money you're spending? And Bernanke just openly admits it's not.
He says it so casually, too.
Right. He says, quote, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account, end quote. I mean, that is a blatant admission of the magic checkbook from literally the highest monetary authority in the world.
And the second half of that ledger equation is just as important to understand. When you make your monthly mortgage payment, when you actually pay down the principal of that loan, that commercial bank money is literally destroyed.
It just disappears.
It's wiped off the ledger entirely.
Hmm.
The overall money supply shrinks. But, and this is the crucial part, the interest you pay on top of the principal, that is not destroyed.
Let me guess. The private bank keeps that.
Exactly. They keep it as pure profit.
Wow. But hold on a second. If private banks have the legal authority to just type money into existence on a computer, why do they even care about credit scores? I mean, why not just lend $1 billion to every single person who walks through the door if it literally costs the bank nothing to create the money?
That is the logical next question. And the answer comes down to the risk of insolvency and the need for collateral. So, while they do create the money out of nothing, banks are legally required to maintain a certain ratio of capital to absorb losses. If people default on their loans, if those assets turn out to be completely worthless, the bank's equity is wiped out and they go bankrupt.
Okay. So there is a limit. But if private banks have all this power, why was this even allowed to happen in the first place? Where did this start?
Well, this structural reality actually traces back to a massive historical legislative loophole.
The 1844 Bank Charter Act. This part absolutely blew my mind because it shows how a literal 19th century oversight basically birthed the entire modern financial world.
Precisely. So back in the mid-1800s, commercial banks were actually printing their own physical paper promissory notes.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. Unsurprisingly, they printed way too many notes, which caused rampant inflation and completely destabilized the British economy. So Robert Peel's conservative government stepped in and passed the 1844 Act to stop private banks from printing paper money.
They took that power back for the state.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But they were legislating for a world of paper and metal. They completely failed to regulate the concept of electronic or deposit money.
Right. The banks just realized, hey, we don't need to print paper anymore. We can just issue credit on our ledgers. And that loophole was just never closed.
Never closed. Which brings us back to your question about why banks don't just lend to everyone. Because they're playing with ledger entries that carry real-world risk, commercial banks logically prefer to lend where there is solid recoverable collateral.
Which usually means houses.
Exactly. If a bank creates money to fund, say, a new small business or a factory, and that business fails, the bank has very little they can actually recover.
They can't repossess a failed business idea.
Right, but if they lend against land and property, they can always repossess the house. And the source material highlights this incredible statistic. By August 2011, an astonishing 85.5% of consumer bank lending in the UK was directed solely into housing.
85.5%. That is massive. And the consequence of that lending bias is just this profound structural distortion of the whole economy. Because that newly created money isn't funding, productive GDP growth. It's not building new bridges or funding cancer research. It is just funneling massive amounts of new credit into a fixed, limited supply of houses.
Which does what to the prices?
It mechanically inflates them. It pushes asset prices through the roof.
Right. And the documentary draws a really sharp historical parallel here to the Dutch tulip bubble of 1637.
Oh, I love this comparison.
It's perfect, right? Because it wasn't just that people suddenly decided they really loved flowers. Financial innovation in the Netherlands at the time introduced early margin lending and futures contracts.
So they were using credit to buy flowers.
Exactly. People were trading paper contracts for tulip bulbs that were still buried in the ground, using leveraged credit. That financialization allowed a literal virus-infected flower to reach a valuation 10 times the annual salary of a skilled worker.
It's just absurd when you say it out loud.
It really is. But it demonstrates this 400-year-old pattern. When you decouple financial instruments from underlying productive reality, you generate speculative manias.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because unlike tulips, which, you can just choose not to buy housing, is a fundamental human necessity. You have to live somewhere.
You can't opt out of the housing market.
Right. So this systemic preference creates a brutal generational squeeze. People who bought houses decades ago see their property values skyrocket and they feel incredibly wealthy.
They feel like financial geniuses.
Exactly. But on a macroeconomic level, the documentary points out it's actually a zero-sum game. Because the only way that inflated house prices ever actually realized in a sale is if the next generation, which is often the seller's own children, takes on substantially more debt to buy it.
It's a treadmill. It forces the general population to become increasingly indebted merely to secure shelter.
We're basically financializing our own living spaces.
We are. And this brings us to the core paradox of the entire debt-based monetary system.
The debt paradox. This is the part that really messes with your head, because it asks the question, what happens if we all try to do the quote-unquote right thing? Like, what if we all just pay off our debts?
Right. The documentary actually points to politicians, like they show footage of former UK Prime Minister David Cameron, who loudly advocated for a savings-based economy.
Which sounds incredibly responsible.
It sounds great on a campaign trail. But the source points out that under the mathematical rules of our current system, a purely savings-based economy is literally an oxymoron.
Because money is debt in this system.
Precisely. Every digital pound or dollar in your checking account only exists because someone, somewhere, took out a loan. If every citizen, every business, and every government acted with perfect financial prudence.
Like if we all aggressively paid off our credit cards, zeroed out our mortgages, paid off the national debt.
The money supply would contract until it essentially vanished. We would be left with only that original 3% of physical cash.
Wow.
Trade would freeze entirely, and the economy would plunge into a catastrophic depression. The system quite literally requires a constantly expanding pool of debt just to maintain a functional money supply.
But wait, if all these private high street banks are independently creating their own digital commercial money, how do they actually interact with each other?
What do you mean?
Like, if I buy a house and my mortgage is with Bank A, but the seller uses Bank B, Bank A can't just send their internally created magic ledger numbers over to Bank B, right? Bank B doesn't trust Bank A's magic checkbook.
Ah, right. That is where the hidden second tier of our monetary system comes into play, central bank reserves.
Okay, what are those?
You can think of them as highly exclusive casino chips that only the central bank and the major commercial banks are allowed to handle.
So you and I can never touch these?
Never. The general public can never access this tier of money. When your transaction clears, your bank doesn't actually send your digital deposits to the seller's bank. Instead, your bank instructs the central bank to transfer these special central bank reserves from their account to the seller's bank's account.
In a process called intraday clearing, right? So because the banks are incentivized to aggressively expand the money supply by issuing all this commercial debt, because, that generates their profit margins and their massive executive bonuses, they eventually lead us into systemic over-indebtedness.
That's the inevitable outcome.
Right. The public can't service the interest anymore, defaults start rippling upward, and the whole system fractures.
Yes. It creates this mechanized boom and bust cycle. During the boom, the banks effectively privatize the profits of money creation. But notice the mechanics of the bust.
When the debt burden gets too heavy.
Right. When the major banks face insolvency, the state is forced to step in with taxpayer bailouts. And why do they do that? Because allowing those banks to fail wouldn't just wipe out some wealthy shareholders, it would literally extinguish 97% of the public's money supply.
We are essentially held hostage by the architecture of the ledger itself.
That's a great way to put it.
And the documentary makes this really compelling argument about the wealth distribution angle here, because this debt-based money system is highly regressive. The vast majority of the debt is held by the lower and middle classes, right?
Absolutely.
And they have to constantly pay interest just to possess the medium of exchange. So that interest acts as a vacuum, relentlessly pulling wealth upward into the financial sector. The documentary frames it as this continuous, invisible redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich.
And that redistribution does not stop at national borders either. To truly understand the gravity of these sources, we have to scale this up to the international level.
Yeah. Let's talk about currency wars. Because how does fiat money and credit creation dictate global geopolitics?
Well, up until the latter half of the 20th century, there was at least a physical anchor to this system. The documentary takes us back to the Bretton Woods Agreement, which established the post-World War II financial order.
Right, where global currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar was rigidly tied to a specific amount of physical gold held in vaults.
Exactly. That anchor was specifically designed to prevent the exact kind of unchecked money creation we've been discussing. But the mathematical reality of state spending eventually caught up with the system.
As it always does.
Right.
Yeah.
Throughout the 1960s, the U.S. government was heavily expanding its money supply to simultaneously fund the Vietnam War and a bunch of domestic social programs.
And other nations started noticing, specifically the French, right? they looked at the sheer volume of dollars flooding the globe and realized the math just didn't add up anymore.
There was no way the U.S. had enough physical gold to back all those paper promises.
Exactly. And the French were so distrustful of the ledger that they famously sent a literal gunboat to New York Harbor to physically demand their gold bullion back in exchange for their dollars. I mean, can you imagine that today?
It's incredible. And the Nixon administration's response to that pressure in 1971 fundamentally altered human history.
They didn't hand over the gold.
No, they didn't. Instead, President Nixon unilaterally suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The anchor was completely cut. And we officially entered the era of pure fiat currency.
Where money is backed by nothing.
Nothing other than state decree and market confidence.
And without the physical constraint of gold, the global financial sector just exploded into what the documentary aptly calls a casino economy.
Because if you don't need underlying, tangible commodities to back your currency, you can start building financial instruments on top of financial instruments.
Right, and this is where we see the rise of complex derivatives. A derivative is basically just a financial contract that derives its value from the performance of an underlying entity, like an interest rate or an asset, or even another derivative.
You don't need to actually own a tangible asset at all. You just need to place a highly leveraged bet on its future price movement.
And the scale of this unanchored betting is difficult to even conceptualize. The sources note that instruments like credit default swaps, which are essentially these unregulated insurance contracts where you bet on whether a specific piece of debt will default, they grew from a global value of $1 trillion in 2002 to $60 trillion by 2007.
60 trillion. It's almost unimaginable.
And the foreign exchange market, where algorithms are just trading these fiat currencies against each other based on micro fluctuations in confidence, that market now processes $4 trillion in trades every single day.
And the vulnerability of such a highly leveraged, purely digital system was completely exposed during the 2008 financial crisis. The source actually recounts a terrifying scenario that most of the public is still totally unaware of.
Right, because we think of bank runs as, people lining up outside a brick and mortar branch like in Mary Poppins.
Yeah, exactly.
But 2008 triggered an electronic bank run. Institutional investors lost confidence in the ledger entirely. In the span of just a few hours, $550 billion was digitally drawn out of U.S. money market accounts.
$550 billion in hours.
Yes. The Treasury tried to pump in $105 billion to stabilize it, and they realized it was like throwing a pebble into a tsunami. Their internal models estimated that if they hadn't completely frozen the system and issued blanket guarantees, $5.5 trillion would have been withdrawn by that afternoon.
Oh my.
The entire U.S. economy would have collapsed, and it would have dragged the global financial system down with it within 24 hours.
That fragility is completely systemic. But the documentary argues that for developing nations, this international monetary system isn't just a risk. It functions as a literal mechanism of control. They label it financial imperialism.
The mechanics of how this plays out are really ruthless. The sources detail the role of institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Right. When developing nations hit economic turbulence and face sovereign debt crises, they get locked out of global capital markets. So they turn to the IMF for emergency loans just to keep their imports flowing and their governments running.
But those loans come with intense conditionalities attached, which are known as structural adjustment programs.
And this is where it gets dark, because the IMF effectively demands that the debtor nation restructure its entire domestic economy just to ensure the international debt is serviced.
Which typically mandates severe austerity measures.
Yeah. Slashing public spending on domestic healthcare, education, infrastructure. And it demands the deregulation and privatization of state-owned assets, often selling them off to foreign corporations.
And most insidiously, they mandate that the nation pivot its economy away from self-sustainment and toward export-led growth.
Right, so they have to extract their natural resources or grow cash crops strictly for export just to earn the U.S. dollars required to pay the interest on their international debt.
The documentary argues this effectively turns them into vassal states. They lose their sovereign ability to direct their own resources for the benefit of their own citizens.
They remain permanently tethered to the demands of international finance.
It creates this extractive loop where the global south is continually exporting real, tangible wealth, like minerals, agriculture, labor, in exchange for digital fiat currency created out of thin air by banks in the global north. All simply to serve as the interest on historical debts.
Which brings me to a really foundational question here. If there is no gold in the vault, if there is no intrinsic physical value backing any of these major currencies, and the system is this volatile and this extractive, why does this multi-trillion-dollar global apparatus hold together at all? Why doesn't the illusion just shatter?
Well, the answer lies in the etymology of our financial vocabulary. If you trace the Latin root of the word credit, it comes from the verb credere,
Credere, which translates to, wait, to believe.
to believe, to trust. The entire global architecture, from the digital pounds created when a young couple signs a mortgage, to the $60 trillion derivative markets, to the structural adjustment of sovereign nations, it runs purely 100% on collective belief.
Wow.
As long as we all wake up every day and collectively believe that the numbers flashing on the banking screens represent real value, the system functions. The moment that belief evaporates, as we saw in the electronic run of 2008, the mathematics collapse.
So what does this all mean? Synthesizing everything from our sources today. The money in your bank account is not a stored physical asset. It is an accounting entry born out of debt.
Exactly.
And this mechanic incentivizes commercial banks to pump credit into collateralized assets like housing, which inflates prices and drives down the real standard of living. And on a macro level, it requires an ever-expanding bubble of debt just to prevent economic contraction, while enabling a form of international financial imperialism that traps developing nations.
It is a really stark reality. However, it's crucial to note that the source material doesn't merely diagnose the pathology of the system. It actually explores frameworks for international currency reform. There are robust proposals out there for transitioning away from this debt-as-money paradigm.
Right, they look at how we can actually rebuild the foundation. What do those alternative models look like?
The core idea is to replace unanchored fiat debt currency with a currency backed by something universally necessary, fundamentally scarce, and objectively measurable.
Like what?
Well, one of the most fascinating proposals is a thermodynamic currency, tying the international unit of account directly to renewable energy production, such as kilowatt hours. Another model suggests backing the currency with a diversified basket of essential tangible commodities.
The implications of that are massive, because by tying the creation of money back to the physical reality of the planet and our actual, tangible, productive capacity, you essentially strip private entities of the ability to create infinite digital money to fuel speculative bubbles.
Precisely. It would fundamentally alter the incentive structure of the global economy. Instead of the financial sector extracting billions by shuffling highly leveraged digital derivatives around, capital would be mechanically directed toward actual physical value creation.
And sustainable resource management.
Exactly. It aims to return money to its original utility,
Yeah.
serving as a stable tool for the productive economy, rather than forcing the productive economy to service the endless growth requirements of the monetary system.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We talked about how the word credit literally translates to belief. This vast, deeply complex, and often incredibly destructive debt-based system only exercises power over our lives because of our collective participation in it.
Because we accept the ledger as reality.
Yeah, exactly. So what happens on the day that the everyday person, the 97% of us who do not genuinely benefit from this architecture, simply stops believing in it? Could the solution to untangling the world's most complex financial webs begin with something as simple as changing what we fundamentally choose to value? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.